We didn't know the exact moment it all went wrong. That's the thing about experiments at the edge of reality. Failure doesn't arrive with flashing lights or sirens. It creeps in like a shadow you don't notice until it's already swallowed you whole. The mission was supposed to push human understanding to its furthest frontier. A remote station orbiting a black hole, designed to study its properties and maybe, just maybe, tap into its potential as an energy source. It wasn't some wild theory. The math checked out. It always does, until it doesn't. Our station, Helios 7, sat just outside the event horizon, a place where time and space themselves twisted in ways our minds weren't built to comprehend. They called it safe proximity. But standing there, staring out at the void, I could never shake the feeling that we were ants dancing on the rim of an abyss. The first days went as planned. Data streamed in, gravitational waves, radiation levels, things so far beyond me they might as well have been magic. The crew of 6 worked in silence most of the time, heads buried in consoles. You'd think being surrounded by the most brilliant minds on Earth would feel inspiring, but out here, inspiration was as empty as the black hole we orbited. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you start listening for things that aren't there. We were running an experiment, a controlled energy release into the black hole to test a theory about extracting Hawking radiation. I don't understand the science behind it, but the idea was simple enough. Fire a beam of energy, measure the response, repeat. The first tests went fine, nothing dramatic. The black hole didn't care. It was vast, indifferent, eternal. But then, during the third test, something changed. We noticed it first on the monitors, a fluctuation in the readings. Nothing major, just a spike here, a drop there. The lead scientist, Dr. Elara Shaw, waved it off as noise. She was calm, methodical, the kind of person you trusted to stay rational even when the universe itself was losing its mind. "It's nothing," she said, her voice steady. "Just interference." But I saw her hand tremble when she reached for her coffee. The first strange thing happened that night, or what we called night. Time doesn't mean much out here, but we still kept shifts to keep our sanity. I was off duty, sitting in the observation deck, staring at the black hole. I can't explain what I saw. It wasn't a shape, not exactly, but it felt like movement. Like the edge of the black hole was rippling, shifting, alive. My stomach turned, and I looked away, telling myself it was just the after effects of staring too long into the void. I didn't mention it to anyone. Not then. The next morning, the fluctuations were worse. The monitors were picking up signals, patterns in the noise, rhythmic, almost like a pulse. Shaw didn't wave it off this time. "We'll recalibrate the sensors," she said, her tone clipped, avoiding eye contact. The crew started to notice other things, small things. A hum in the walls that wasn't there before. Lights flickering, not enough to be obvious, just a subtle, stuttering glow. And the dreams. No one wanted to admit they were having them, not at first. It was Shaw who broke the silence during one of our tense meal breaks. "I keep dreaming about the black hole," she said, staring at her untouched tray. "But in the dream, it's closer." No one laughed. We all started sharing after that, as if speaking the words would make the dreams less real. The details were different, but the theme was always the same. The black hole wasn't just out there. It was reaching for us. The dreams became harder to ignore. Each night, they felt more vivid, more invasive. It wasn't just the black hole anymore. It was something within it. Something that watched. Something that waited. None of us talked about it during the day, but you could see it in everyone's eyes. The same restless exhaustion, the same hesitation to close them, even for a moment. Shaw buried herself in work, running diagnostic after diagnostic on the equipment. "It's interference," she muttered over and over, as if trying to convince herself more than anyone else. The pulse in the data grew stronger. It wasn't noise, it was a pattern, deliberate and repeating. At first, we thought it might be a natural phenomenon, a cosmic echo bouncing off the black hole. But it wasn't random. It was too precise, almost like a signal. And then the signal spoke. We were in the control room, analyzing the latest data when it happened. The sound crackled through the speakers, low and garbled at first, like static from a broken radio. Then it resolved into something worse. A voice. No language, no words, just a deep, resonant tone that filled the room, vibrating in our chests. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. It felt like it was speaking directly into my skull, bypassing my ears altogether. We froze, every one of us, staring at the speakers as if they might leap off the walls. Shaw was the first to move, slamming the mute button and silencing the voice. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Shaw didn't answer. She just stared at the console, her hands trembling for the first time. The next hours were chaos. We argued over what to do, whether to keep listening, whether to shut everything down and call Earth. But Earth was over an hour away, even by light-speed communication. And deep down, we all knew no one there could help us. The voice came back that night. This time, it wasn't in the speakers. It was in our dreams. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The dream had been so real, so vivid. I was standing on the edge of the event horizon, staring into the black hole. It wasn't empty. Something was inside, shifting and writhing, a presence that defied description. It saw me, and for a moment, I felt the unbearable weight of its gaze. When I stumbled out into the corridor, I wasn't the only one. The others were there too, pale and wide-eyed, shuffling like sleepwalkers. No one spoke. No one had to. Shaw tried to keep us together. "We're scientists," she said, her voice cracking but determined. "We don't panic. We analyze. We figure this out." But how do you analyze something that isn't supposed to exist? The station began to change. Subtle at first, a hum in the walls, a flicker in the lights. But then it became undeniable. Doors that wouldn't open or close. Shadows that didn't align with their sources. And the worst part was the black hole. It was closer. Not physically. It couldn't be. We were in orbit, locked in place by the station's engines. But when you looked out the observation windows, it felt like it was leaning in, pressing against the glass. "It's not possible," Shaw muttered, staring out at the void. "It's an optical illusion. It has to be." But it wasn't just the black hole. The pulse was getting louder, more insistent. It wasn't a signal anymore. It was a presence. And it wanted something. It started with the walls. At first, they felt warm to the touch, almost imperceptibly so. Shaw dismissed it as residual heat from the station's systems. "Thermal expansion," she said flatly, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. But by the next day, the warmth turned to a faint vibration, like a heartbeat pulsing through the metal. The sound wasn't loud, but it was constant, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to sync with the signal. It didn't take long before we stopped touching the walls altogether. None of us slept much after that. The dreams were worse, more vivid, more invasive. It was like the black hole wasn't content to stay in the void. It was pushing into us, into our minds. I stopped looking out the observation windows entirely. The last time I did, I swore I saw something moving along the edge of the event horizon, and then the shadows started. It wasn't like the lights flickering on and off. That would have been easy to explain. No, these were different. They were there even when the lights were steady. Dark shapes pooling in corners, stretching unnaturally across the walls. They didn't move. Not at first. But you could feel them watching. We stopped using certain corridors entirely. The air felt wrong in them, heavy and stifling, as if something unseen was pressing against our chests. When you walked through them, you could hear faint whispers, not words, just a murmur at the edge of perception. Shaw refused to acknowledge it. "It's stress," she said, pacing the control room. "We're all exhausted. We're imagining things. There's a scientific explanation for everything." But there wasn't. The first disappearance happened 3 days after the signal began. Bennett, one of the engineers, didn't show up for his shift. We searched the entire station, every room, every corridor. He was gone. No trace, no sign of struggle, nothing. His absence left a hole in the crew, a tangible void we couldn't ignore. We were supposed to be 6, and now we were 5. The air felt colder, heavier. The shadows seemed darker. We tried to convince ourselves he'd gotten disoriented, maybe gone out an airlock by mistake. But deep down, we all knew that wasn't true. The second disappearance was worse. It was Harper, the station's medic. She'd been jittery for days, muttering to herself, avoiding eye contact. One moment, she was in the mess hall with us, silent but present. The next, she was gone. I was the last one to see her. She'd been staring out one of the observation windows, her breath fogging the glass. "It's not a black hole," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I asked her what she meant, but she didn't answer. She just turned and walked down one of the shadowed corridors. I called after her, but by the time I reached the end of the hallway, she was gone. Shaw ordered a lockdown. Every door sealed, every system locked into place. "No one leaves the control room unless absolutely necessary," she said, her voice tight with fear she couldn't hide anymore. But it didn't help. That night, the hum in the walls grew louder, almost deafening. The shadows moved now, sliding along the walls like oil. I swear I heard voices calling my name, soft and distorted, like they were coming from underwater. The station itself felt alive, like it was breathing, watching. And the black hole, it was closer. I knew it couldn't be, but I felt it, pressing against the station like a predator testing the strength of a cage. Shaw finally admitted what we were all thinking. "It's not just a black hole," she said, her voice hollow. "It's something else. Something we woke up." Shaw's admission hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, like the station itself was holding its breath. We sat in the control room, each of us avoiding the other's eyes, as if saying the truth out loud might somehow make it worse. But deep down, we knew it didn't matter. The black hole, or whatever it was, had already noticed us. The signal changed that night. It wasn't just a pulse anymore, it was a melody, a low, resonant hum that wound its way through the station like a living thing. It didn't come from the speakers this time. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the floors, vibrating in our bones. And then the lights went out. Not all at once. It was slow, deliberate, like something was testing us, savoring the fear it stirred. First, the auxiliary corridor lights dimmed to a faint red glow. Then the overheads flickered, leaving long stretches of shadow. Shaw scrambled to override the systems, her fingers flying over the console. "It's not a malfunction," she muttered under her breath. "Something's overriding us." The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. And the shadows, those impossible, unnatural shadows, moved with purpose. They weren't just stretching across the walls anymore. They were creeping toward us, pooling at the edges of the control room. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie crimson glow. It didn't help. If anything, it made the shadows worse, deeper, more defined. I could feel them watching us, waiting. And then the doors opened. It shouldn't have been possible. Shaw had locked down every system. But the main hatch slid open with a groaning hiss, revealing the dark corridor beyond. "Stay here," Shaw ordered, grabbing a flashlight. "No," I said, my voice barely steady. "We stick together." But Shaw was already stepping into the corridor, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. I hesitated, then followed, the others trailing behind me. The hum was louder in the corridor, almost unbearable. The walls seemed to ripple, the shadows writhing like living things. The air was thick, heavy, like we were wading through water. We reached the observation deck, where Harper had last been seen. The glass panels stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the black hole. But it wasn't the void that held our attention. It was the figure standing in front of the glass. At first, I thought it was Harper. The build was right, the stance familiar. But as we moved closer, the figure didn't turn, didn't move. It just stood there, staring into the black hole. "Harper?" Shaw's voice was barely a whisper. The figure turned, slowly, deliberately. And that's when I realized it wasn't Harper. Not anymore. The face was wrong. The eyes were too wide, too dark, like they'd been hollowed out and filled with something that wasn't human. The mouth twisted into a smile that didn't belong on any living thing. "It's beautiful," the figure said, in a voice that wasn't Harper's. It was layered, distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. The others froze, too shocked to move. Shaw stepped forward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What are you?" she demanded. The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "We are what waits," it said. "And you have opened the door." Before any of us could react, the glass behind the figure cracked, a spider web of fractures spreading outward. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, and the figure turned back to the black hole. "You can't stop it," it said, almost gently. "It's already here." The glass shattered. It wasn't the violent explosion we expected. It broke in silence, fragments falling into the void like raindrops. But the silence was worse. It was unnatural, oppressive, like the universe itself had paused to watch what came next. The figure, the thing that had been Harper, stepped forward, its body dissolving as it moved. Pieces of it unraveled into the air, strands of flesh and shadow pulled toward the black hole. It didn't scream. It didn't resist. It just let go. And then it was gone. We barely had time to process what we'd seen before the station groaned around us, a deep, resonant sound that made my teeth ache. The black hole wasn't just pulling at the remnants of Harper, it was pulling at us. The station, the walls, reality itself. Shaw grabbed my arm, her face pale but determined. "We have to get to the core," she said. "If we can shut down the experiment." Her words were cut off by a sudden, sharp crack. The floor beneath us buckled, tilting violently. I grabbed the nearest console, my fingers scrambling for purchase as the others screamed. The hum had turned into a roar, a deafening cacophony that drowned out everything else. We stumbled through the corridors, the station shifting and groaning like a living thing in its death throes. The shadows weren't just watching us anymore. They were reaching for us, tendrils of darkness slithering along the walls and floors. I swear I heard them whispering, calling my name in voices I didn't recognize. We reached the core, the heart of the experiment. The room was bathed in a sickly green light, the machinery thrumming with energy. The containment field that had kept the black hole at bay was failing, its edges flickering and distorting. Shaw didn't hesitate. She dove into the controls, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I can collapse the field," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "It'll seal the rift, but it might take the station with it." "Do it," I said, my voice barely audible over the roar. The others hesitated, their faces pale with fear. But there was no time for debate. The black hole was pressing in, its edges bleeding into the room like ink spreading through water. Shaw's hands moved faster, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Almost there," she muttered. And then the shadows came alive. They surged into the room, a mass of writhing darkness that swallowed everything in its path. I screamed as a tendril wrapped around my ankle, pulling me toward the void. It was cold, impossibly cold, and it burned like fire. Shaw shouted something, but her words were lost in the chaos. She slammed her fist onto the console, and the room erupted in light. For a moment, everything froze. The shadows, the black hole, the station itself. It all hung in perfect stillness, as if caught between one breath and the next. And then the light exploded outward, blinding and all-consuming. I woke up in darkness. At first, I thought I was dead, but then I felt the cold metal beneath me, the faint hum of life support systems. The station was still there. I was still there. But the others were gone. I stumbled through the corridors, my steps echoing in the silence. The shadows were gone, but so was everything else. No voices, no figures, no sign of life. Just me and the faint, distant roar of the black hole. When I reached the observation deck, I stopped. The black hole was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't just a void, it was a mirror, reflecting something that shouldn't exist. I saw my own face staring back at me. But it wasn't my face. The eyes were wrong. Too wide. Too dark. And then it smiled. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the void. But eventually, I turned away. There was no point in running, no point in fighting. The black hole wasn't just outside the station. It was inside me, inside everything. It had been watching us all along, waiting for us to notice it. And now, it was awake.